In the two previous videos, we identified the sutures of the skull and the bones of the skull. Now I'd like to look at the markings of the skull. So we will work on the markings per bone. So for example, we will start with the frontal bone and identify the markings there. So I'm going to go ahead and say the name of the marking and the name of the bone. For quiz purposes and testing purposes, you may be asked to name the marking and the bone, or you may just be asked to name the marking, or it may say name the bone. So you need to be able to do both. So to begin with, let's identify this marking. It's also located here. This is the supraorbital foramen of the frontal bone. There's a marking or an opening inside the frontal bone here and here, lined with a mucous membrane, and those are the frontal sinuses of the frontal bone. Name this marking. This is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Name this marking. Zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Name the marking that I have my pencil in. That is the external acoustic or auditory meatus of the temporal bone. Name this marking. Styloid process of the temporal bone. Another marking of the temporal bone, you can see from this view, it's where this plastic cup is. On this skull, it would be right here where my finger can rest, on this side and on this side. Mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Name this marking, which is also located over here. Infraorbital foramen of the maxilla. Name this marking. Incisive fossa of the maxilla. We identified this suture on the previous video. Go ahead and name it again. Median palatine suture. Name this marking, which would also be on this side as well. Palatine process of the maxilla. Identify this marking, the large opening. Foramen magnum of the occipital bone. Name this marking and this marking. Occipital condyles of the occipital bone. Name this marking. This is the mandibular condyle or condylar process of the mandible. Name this marking. Coronoid process of the mandible. Name this marking. The mandibular notch. Name this marking, which is also located here. Mental foramen of the mandible. Name this marking. The mandibular symphysis. And name this marking, which is also located on this side as well. The mandibular foramen. This region of the mandible, the body, this region of the mandible, the ramus. Name this marking where the tip of my pencil is. Hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid. Name this marking. The sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Name this marking also on this side. You can also see this marking laterally. That is the greater wing of the sphenoid. Inside the sphenoid bone, there's a sphenoidal sinus. This bone is the ethmoid. Inside that bone, there are ethmoid sinuses or air cells. Name this marking. The crista galli of the ethmoid. Name this marking, which is also on this side. Cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Name this marking. The perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. I believe those are all the markings. There is one more bone that I neglected to ask you on the previous video. The bone is located right here. It's on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity on this side and on this side. And it is a bone. Name this bone. Inferior nasal concha.